Hello and welcome to the home front. You know, criticism is such a part of life. Sometimes it can feel like people are criticizing us all the time, or we're criticizing other people. And especially when it comes to husbands and wives. Husbands critical of their wives critical of their husbands. Does it have a place? Does it have a purpose? Is there anything positive that can come out of it? People instinctively recoil at criticism. Someone tells me, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. So instinctively, I may try and defend myself. And surely that's not going to help me. How should a person criticize in a correct way, in a positive way, if at all? We're honored to have with us today Rabbi Yirmiyahu Abramov. And I wonder, Rabbi, could you share with us some of your thoughts on the issue?
Well, I'd like to criticize your opening remarks. There's very little justification for criticizing at all. It's a tremendous misconcept. People think that the way of altering someone's behavior is by being critical of that person. There are alternatives. There was a great sage called the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim, who focused a lot in his writings on the issue of man-to-man relationships. And one of the big no-nos that he registers is a concept called nargan, in Hebrew translated as the critic. He says that narganut, being critical of someone else, is a great destroyer of human relationships.
But it seems like people are naturally critical of other people, aren't they? I mean, I'm reminded, this is already very old, 2,500 years ago already, a great man by the name of Aristotle said that if a person wants to avoid criticism, he should do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. That means everyone criticizes.
Okay.
How can you tell me not to criticize?
So there's a way of amending someone's behavior. Usually the objective of criticism is because you want to change a certain mode of behavior on the person that you're criticizing. You may recall one of the great bestsellers in history was a little book called The 1 Minute Manager.
Oh, yes,
the 1 Minute Manager sold tens of millions of copies in many, many, many languages. It is a very short little book, maybe 15, 20 minutes worth of reading. But he had the central theme of the entire message there, talking about this great business executive who has many, many workers and many factories, and people couldn't figure out what was the secret of his success in management. And they couldn't figure out why the man was always relaxed. And they came to meet him, and his desk was always tidy. And how is this guy is straddling this huge business empire? What's the secret? So an interviewer arrived to follow him around. And he noticed one very peculiar thing. He noticed that while this fellow was a very hands-on manager, and he would walk around his factories and his businesses and with hands-on and look at what everyone was doing, but he never said one word of criticism. The only time he spoke was to praise. He was looking to catch someone red-handed doing something well, and he'd say, great, you're doing well.
Positive reinforcement.
Positive reinforcement. So in a certain sense, one can achieve the exact same thing in positive reinforcement. So husband and wife are interacting all day over many, many things. And there are things that each one would like to tweak on the other one's behavior. Sometimes there are certain things which just are completely intolerable. So how do you change a person's mode of conduct? Just by the way, whatever I'm saying is all that more magnified with our children. You know, parents very often think that, well, I'm an educator, I've got to bring up my children to be respected, decent, well-behaved, dignified people. So every time there's some form of slovenly behavior or misbehavior, I've got to criticize, right? And you find a situation where in many homes, the only words that children are hearing from their parents who are doing it in the name of education are negative criticism. And the kid at some stage says, you know, I just can't handle it. Just
soul-destroying for a kid.
Soul-destroying, absolutely. And it really is soul-destroying for anybody. An employer who is criticizing his workers may think he's educating them, but really he's destroying their morale. So we need to readjust our whole mode of behavior. Of course, you can modify other people's behavior, and that's very important. But the modification has to be done from a positive perspective. So let's take some classic examples. Cooking, right? The husband doesn't like his wife's cooking, right? Now, there must be certain foods of hers that are reasonable. So instead of every time commenting negatively or saying, boy, my mother's soup was so much different, rather focus on those positive tidbits that she makes for him and comment positively. And she will get it. She will get it that when does she get a positive comment? When when there's certain things which she likes. Of course, the person in the context of marriage, a man can say, I just don't like cauliflower. You make a fantastic effort but I really prefer broccoli. That's not called criticism. That's just expressing preferences. But in general, always try and see if you can focus on positive things.
So that's nice for an easy, simple example, like the cooking. But if, let's say someone does something which is something which makes the other person very angry, does something which is rude or just plain annoying, and keeps on doing it.
Okay.
I don't criticize. Surely I have the right to say, that really annoys me.
Okay, let me give you a radical example. Let's go back to the two parents educating children. Okay, father comes home and he finds the kids' playroom in a tremendous mess. Everything is upside down, and there's toys strewn all over the place, and there's clothes and apple cores and remainders of food, whatever. And so the father can walk in and say, this is outrageous. Kids, how can you live this way? Now, come on, I want to see this room cleaned up. So as he'll turn around after giving his impassioned speech about the virtues of cleanliness, the kids will probably, there's a traditional kind of reaction of kids going, no, and they feel resentment. They were criticized. They were lambasted. Now, the father could achieve the exact same thing. Just imagine the following scenario. He walks into a room, and the room is littered, and it's in a great mess. But he spots in the corner, there's one corner, a few feet by feet, small little corner, which is clean. So he walks over to the corner, he calls his kids, come here, kids. You see this corner? This looks great. Let's see if the whole room can look this way. Now, he's going to get the same response, if not a much better response. He focused on something positive, and he says, now let's reinforce that. Let's try and see if all of this can, if the whole room can look this way. And so it is, with a little bit of creativity and a little bit of thought, a person can definitely change the whole atmosphere.
Can I just push you on that, Rabbi? Because, life with a spouse can be a little more complicated than that. Let's say, it can be something as simple as leaving clothes lying around on the floor, but it could be something much more complicated, something much more deeply ingrained in a person's character traits or in what they do with their life that really annoys the other party. I mean, there it's not really possible to sort of praise your way out of a problem. You have to address it. Sometimes you have to sit down and say, listen, this thing, I want you to stop. Is that valid? Do I have the right to demand of my wife, or does she have the right to demand of me that I stop doing something I enjoy because it annoys her?
So without a doubt, when points need to be made of behavior modification, right? A wife has the right to say, I don't like your socks lying around the living room, right? When you go to bed at night, take your socks off and put them in the apt place, right? That's a legitimate request. But it's a question of the tone, and it's a question of the general atmosphere that is permeated. Sometimes humor is a great asset. If a person is able to get some humor into his critique, it just somehow deflates the venom or the anger. Now, this doesn't preclude that husband and wife sometimes can sit down and have frank discussions. And he can sit down in a very calm, nice atmosphere and say, dear, it's you're such a great wife, and you do so many things so positively. I wonder if you can put a bit more attention to keeping your checkbook balanced, for example, right? You know, which is very often an issue of, you know, the wife goes shopping and she's doing, and she doesn't, and there's always a catastrophe in the bank account because, right? So he can say, but when do you try and talk about this behavior modification? The time to talk about it is when there's a calm, natural, comfortable atmosphere. In other words, never ever respond at the time when there's been some infraction of behavior, when there's been something which is uncomfortable, and say, well, you always do this. A person should have the ability to be able to say, okay, now's not the time. It's only going to evoke a knee-jerk reaction. So now's not the time for this. Let's do, this is something to be discussed. And after dinner, when we relax, I just want to bring up one little point. Can we discuss it now? And try and, when things need to be modified, of course one can bring these things up, because sometimes there can be things which can be destructive. It's the same thing with children. It's the same thing with anybody, for that matter. There must be, criticism can be taken well if it's in a positive environment, if it's in a positive setting, and the vibes are healthy and comfortable. That's a great time.
So in the heat of the moment is bad.
The heat of the moment is usually devastating and destructive, and usually evokes a negative response. It usually evokes a defensive response, and the person will start defending something they don't really even want to defend. But in the heat of the moment, because you had the audacity to criticize. Now, certainly, when raising one's voice or displaying any form of anger, whatever, you should know when we're talking about anger, the Talmud tells us that anger is one of the most destructive forces that exist in any human relationship. So it's a great exercise for a person where in the heat of the moment one wants to say something, but there's a chance that that anger may creep into it. Just sort of, as I say, count to 10, 20, 30, 2,000, whatever it is, and say, we'll discuss this. Let's discuss this. And we found this exemplary type of human behavior by great people very often, where they would defer something and say, you can say, what happened now needs to be discussed. I don't want to discuss it now, because in the heat of the moment, I may exaggerate. Sometimes people tend, when driving home a point in the heat of a moment, they will exaggerate, and because of the passions that are involved. So it's always a better thing to be cerebral about it, to be intelligently discuss it, but it must be in a calm atmosphere.
So people these days, I'm sure everyone's always been saying this in every generation, people say the same thing, but people these days seem busier than ever. Often, I think in most cases, both the husband and wife work. They're busy, with kids, with the rigmarole of everyday life. How do you find time to address these things in a calm fashion? Would you advocate setting aside a certain appointment at a certain time every week to sit down and discuss these things? Or how else can you make sure that you always have time to talk about these things in a calm, collected manner? Yeah,
well, I think in general you've raised a very important issue. Young couples or any married couple, you can assume that they're pretty busy people and they're doing lots of things, and there's there's the flow of life, and sometimes they just never have time to work on their relationship. They must always set aside time. Find the most apt and opportune time, and they must set aside time and to sit down and in a calm, pleasant setting. You don't need to go necessarily out to some kind of a romantic restaurant. It can be when the kids are asleep, and sit down and have a nice, sweet, calm discussion about what needs to, be remedied, etc. So I'm not saying that one should brush under the rug all sorts of behavior which is unacceptable or difficult, but one must find, definitely one should set aside times when there are discussions, and the discussions shouldn't only be around gripes. I'm complaining, and so you have so the wife dreads and the husband dreads the once-a-week griping session when they both come out with a shopping list of gripes. That ain't going to be a very pleasant experience. But they should have time when they're discussing things. But definitely, when there are significant issues, they should be addressed in a calm and healthy atmosphere. Sometimes they can determine when there's something of significance that keeps cropping up. Is, let's find a good time when we can sit down, relax, and discuss it, and let's iron out the issues from all different angles. Now, I'd like to bring up something else which very often is the source of husband-wife criticism. And that's a very simple thing. He's a he and she's a she. Now, men and women are vastly different from each other. The difference is not only physical. Physiologically, they clearly are different to each other. There's a very interesting insight. The Hebrew word for face is panim. Now, those same 4 letters, panim, if you slightly change the vowels, says pnim. In other words, something external is always a reflection of something different internal. So we know that today there have been great attempts to try and the full equality of the sexes. But I don't want to get into that issue. It's a very deep issue. But from a Jewish perspective, without a doubt, men and women are different, right? Now, this difference, which is clearly on the outside, outwardly is physical, but it permeates every single aspect of their being. They are different, they think differently, they have different sets of emotions. Obviously, variances, not all men are the same, not all women are the same. It's spiritually, there are many, many, many vast differences between male and female. And it's, I had recently a young couple arrived after, just after getting married, desperate need of counseling. What was the issue? The issue was that they'd just recently gotten married and they were sitting and eating breakfast together a few days after the marriage, and a nasty little cockroach climbed out of the kitchen cupboard and walked across the floor. And the wife went into hysteria, and she jumped, and she, in doing so, upset the coffee, which spilt over his trousers, and it was also hot. He lashed out at her. He says, "Are you crazy? What's this hysteria all about? It's just merely a little cockroach." And he stepped over and he crushed it under his male foot, and she went into a faint. Now, I'm slightly exaggerating the story, but there are certain nuances, and it's an interesting thing. The Talmud says that women have, because of a very profound depth that they have inherent in their souls spiritually, that they are more sensitive to things which are grotesque, or things which are so. A man doesn't always recognize that. He's an old pro. He would pick up that cockroach and with his hand, and she would actually faint from. So men have to realize, as do women, that there are very profound differences between male and female, and very often criticism is rooted in not recognizing these inherent, deep-seated differences. So therefore, don't jump immediately to fire and criticize. To your male way of thinking, this is outrageous, this form of behavior. And to her female way of thinking, this is just insensitive, a grotesque way of looking at things. So it takes adjustment. One of the great challenges in marriage is that men very often tend to judge their wives' behavior in the context of their own personalities, their own male personalities. And that's a huge mistake, by the same token, women, right? So it's something that it takes time for a couple to adjust themselves, but the best rule of thumb is keep away from these contentious issues of real blatant outward criticism. Rather, let it be in a positive, comfortable type of a context.
I mean, that's something which is not so popular to point out today, the fact that sameness and equality are not necessarily the same thing. That men and women, even though we may say that they're equal, that obviously doesn't mean that they're the same either inside or out. So it's an important point that you're making, which I think people often conflate the two things. But I just want to go back a second to something that you mentioned. When you were talking about resolving difficulties in a calm environment, you mentioned, once the kids have gone to sleep. Was that just because that's when it's calm? Or do you think there's something very important about not having the kids overhear arguments, discussions, criticism that parents may have of each other?
Okay, I want to relate to both things that you said, both in terms of sameness and
Sure.
and equality. We'll discuss that in a few minutes. But with regard to the kids, look, there's nothing more beautiful and calming and settling in the eyes of children when they see that they've got two loving parents who love each other. It gives them a certain sense. Children usually love both their parents equally, and these are the most important figures in their lives. And there's nothing more disturbing to see them at loggerheads, to see them in discord. It's very painful and very unsettling for a child. So kids don't always interpret situations correctly. The husband and wife might be having a very nice, comfortable session of mutual griping, as we said before, criticism in a nice, positive manner, but kids may misinterpret this, and they may finally go to sleep thinking, wow, mommy and daddy don't get on with each other, and that's a very, very painful thing for a child. So I think it really is best done outside of the context where the children are not present. I don't think it's a healthy thing. I think children should see positive, comfortable interaction between father and mother, and they shouldn't see the differences. Differences are a very private, personal, intimate thing that's got to be ironed out in a very private manner.
And that we're not worried that they may create some sort of a fairy tale idea in a kid's mind of what a marriage should be like, which could influence them later in life?
I think that the dangers are more extreme on the other way when kids constantly see parents bickering at each other. Because again, they don't necessarily have the tools to be able to ascertain if this bickering is done within the context of love. Sometimes they can just really misinterpret these things. And I wouldn't be too concerned about building up I think there's nothing greater for a child to have the knowledge that, wow, I've got parents that love each other, and our home is a home of harmony. It's a very, very important factor for a child to have. A child emerges from the home. He goes out to a rough world, to a tough world where there's a lot of criticism and there's a lot of barking all over the place. And when he sort of feels the sense of security in a home is a haven, it's all peaceful and nice and sweet and comfortable. So why expose him to things which he can misinterpret?
Meaning it's okay to sacrifice a bit of that realism on the altar of security, feeling.
I think so.
Feeling.
I would say so. I would say so. Look, sometimes there's situations that need to be related to
Immediately, right?
Immediately. So then if it's done, it's also a lesson for the child. If it's done in a positive manner, it's also a lesson for a child.
Right.
I just want to go back to the point of differences between male and female, man and wife, which I said is a huge issue if not properly understood and related to. By no means are we establishing superiority, right? Man and wife. This is inherent in all the writings of Judaism. Man and women certainly have equality in the sense that they're part of the human race, Homo sapiens, but they have different roles to fulfill, and they have different strengths. And this is the beauty of marriage. The marriage is a marrying of two different types of people, and complementing each other. So this tremendous pursuit of total equality is not something that Judaism expresses easily. there's equality in terms of certainly in terms of rights, in terms of the dignity accorded to each other, etc. But they have different strengths. They have different strengths, and these strengths are let them bring out these different strengths. And but there is potential of clash. You know, as we said before, it's in one of our previous episodes we said that. If marriage is not conducted itself between husband and wife in a positive, constructive manner, it potentially can become fire. It potentially can become a great conflagration, which we want to try and avoid. So, I had a great teacher, spiritual teacher, who before my marriage whispered into my ear and said to me, "Just remember that you're a man and she's a woman. And you may have your whole context of you understand men because you're a man, you understand, but just be sensitive enough to try and learn and get a deeper perception of what a woman is all about. Learn up what a woman is about." And I think then that we're getting back to our point of criticism, much of the criticism stems from this basic misunderstanding of husband and wife. There's another point which we'll touch upon and possibly elaborate in a different setting, in a different context. Two clones don't marry each other. It's a male and a female, we said that. But there are other differences. There are certain built-in circumstantial background differences, right? Now, let me give you a classic. Happened to me. There was a young couple who I had been teaching prior to their marriage, and shortly after marriage, and I was close to this young couple, this young fellow arrived, and I could see with one look that this guy was disturbed. He wasn't looking like a honeymoon couple, like a fellow who's just gotten married, and his face was drawn, there was tension. So I kind of cornered him, and I said, he was a student of mine. I said, "Tell me, is everything okay?" He was a bit evasive, but I pushed the matter a bit because I saw he was disturbed. And he finally blurted out something ridiculous. He says, "No, there's tremendous tension." I said, "What, already tension after a week's marriage?" He says, yes. And I tell you, it's all rooted in she squeezes and I roll. And I said, what on earth is this guy talking about? And then he finally put me out of my misery because I was conjuring up who knows what they were talking about. And he says, we share a common tube of toothpaste. And I come from a very meticulous family. And I was taught by my father that to get out till the very last drop, you've got to meticulously and roll the toothpaste tube to see that everything... And she would come in the morning and give a squeeze and deface this toothpaste tube. And I would have to tell her in the morning at breakfast, I would say, dear, I said it very respectfully. I said, dear, it's much more effective if you roll your toothpaste tube. And she looked at me with wide open eyes. Is this what we're going to discuss every morning at breakfast? So as an old pro-marriage counselor, I said, no problem. Two toothpaste tubes. That's the ultimate solution. But here is a little ridiculous nuance that is something inherent in their background. And this would obviously, he criticized her every morning about her defacing of his toothpaste tube, right? So now this is something that was brought up in their background. I'll give you another case in point, very common. He comes from a family where he saw every morning his wife, his mother, bring his father a cup of coffee in bed. She comes from a family where every morning she saw her father bring her mother a cup of coffee in bed. They're both equally legitimate. It's a question of just, by mutual... So they got married, and they both sit and wait. He's waiting for the coffee, and she's waiting for the coffee, right? And then he starts up and saying, well, the way things are done is that you should be bringing your husband a cup of coffee. And she's saying, what are you talking about? You should be bringing me a cup. And that's already a conflagration. That's already a whole issue. Right. It's criticism, again, rooted in something which needs to be ironed out, and it'll find its way out in marriage. But people have to be sensitive of these two major issues. There are cultural differences, even if they come from the same city. But there are cultural differences which are inherent within every single family. And these give birth to criticism. So rather tolerate something which is uncomfortable, because it's usually on the small issues that husband and wives get on each other's nerves. It's this little ongoing quibbling. They just constantly criticizing over little nonsensical issues.
Some people are squeezers and some people are rollers.
That's right.
Just the way it is.
That's right. That's
Good
right.
metaphor for life. We all have to learn to get along, whether we squeeze or roll.
Okay, good, good.
I wonder though, you know, in an example like that, it's pretty clear your solution, Rabbi, was an ingenious one. Buy simply another tube of toothpaste.
Well, I have an investment with the toothpaste company.
I'm sure. But let's say it's not possible. Let's say, to give an extreme example, they could only afford one tube of toothpaste. But let's make it a case where there is only one of this item, meaning, let's say somebody likes the table set in a certain way and the other person likes the table set in a different way. Or somebody likes the room decorated in such and such a way and the other likes the room decorated in a different way. There is no way of accommodating both views. So there it's not so easy. I mean, if we're telling both to tolerate each other, so what, we're going to end up with a room which is half pink and half blue?
Okay, good comment. I must share with you something. I had a great teacher. He was one of the great geniuses of previous generations. His name was Rabbi Shach. He was the head of a great yeshiva. And I once took one of my students to him for a blessing before his marriage. We took him to this old sage. He was an old man, very sage-like type of person. And he came I brought my student in for a blessing. So the fellow plucked up the courage and said, maybe the rabbi can give me some tips for marriage. So the rabbi gave a big smile and he says, yes, I've got 3 tips for you. And he said, forgo, forgo, forgo. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean he was saying it tongue-in-cheek, but he was saying, you know, sometimes there are so many issues that come up in marriage which are insignificant. And a person will never lose out by foregoing on insignificant issues. All he's doing is he's building up credit. And I'm saying this mutually, husband and wife. If there's a spirit and an atmosphere of foregoing, it will put aside a tremendous amount of the criticism that will be flowing, which is destructive, and a general atmosphere of peace will permeate, and therefore there may be issues of significance, like what kind of a trade should he be plying, what should he be doing with his life, and they may have tremendous divergence of opinion. But if the atmosphere in general is one of being open to compromise, then that atmosphere permeates, and then every discussion of significance that they will have will be conducted in a positive framework. And you'll be amazed how sometimes massive issues just disappear and dissipate when there's a good positive atmosphere.
So there is a room for criticism then about things which really deserve correction, deserve to be corrected. But many things that we argue about, many things that we criticize, really, if we would look deeply into the matter, we would see that they're actually irrelevant. And in the bigger picture of having a peaceful environment of harmony in the home, isn't it worth forgoing? Isn't it worth just saying, you know what? It's not worth addressing. We can't always just buy another tube of toothpaste. But if we always have an attitude of trying to accommodate and tolerate our spouse's idiosyncrasies and preferences, then surely we will merit to have a more peaceful home life.